Now I'm ready to begin creating the joints. And it's always a good idea to reset the joint tool before you begin using it, so I'll double click on that to bring up the tool settings and just reset the tool so that I'm using the default settings. And then I'll begin point snapping these joints to the locators that I've created. So I'll hold down V for point snap, start at that bottom spine location, next on the middle one at the sternum, and then lastly at the bottom of the neck. Press enter. I'll create the one at the clavicle by itself, so V for point snap, and then enter to re-execute the tool. And then I can create the ones for the arm, from the shoulder to the wrist consecutively. You can see that when I hold down V for point snap, the point snap button here at the top is depressed. And it's always a good idea to use the hotkey, because if you turn it on, you'll have to remember to turn it off. And sometimes that can be a nuisance because you forget to turn it off and you want to move something freely and you have point snap on and it point snaps to the closest object or locator or joint. So I tend to use the hotkey, which is V. And enter to finish that. And now I'm going to create the ones for the fingers in a specific order. And I'm using this order because it's the order that the Human IK rigging system that we're going to use later in the course will look for. And that is the middle finger first, the index finger second, the ring finger third, the pinky finger fourth, and then lastly the thumb. And that's the order to which the finger joints and thumb joint chains will be parented to that wrist joint. So I'll create the middle first, then the index. And every time I want to re-engage the joint tool, I can either click on this button or I can use the hotkey. The Y key on your keyboard will initiate the last tool that you use, no matter what it is. So in my case, it's the joint tool. So every time I press Y, I'm reselecting that tool. And then the ring. The pinky. And then finally the thumb. So now I'm going to parent the joints to each other. So I'll start by parenting the clavicle joint to the middle spine joint, because I wouldn't want the arm and the clavicle to rotate with the neck or this lower spine joint. I'd want it to rotate with the joint that's right about on line with the sternum. So I'll select the one of the clavicle first, hold down Shift, and select that second spine joint, and press P to parent. And now the clavicle joint is parented to that joint. So I select the clavicle joint and press the up arrow key on my keyboard, I get to its parent joint. And then I'll parent the shoulder joint to the clavicle. So I'll select the shoulder joint, hold down Shift and select the clavicle joint, press P to parent. And then I'm going to parent the finger and thumb joints to the wrist joint in that specific order that we discussed. So I'll begin with the middle, hold down Shift and select the index second, the ring third, the pinky fourth, and the thumb fifth. And then hold down Shift and select the wrist joint and press P to parent. And now if I look at this in my hypergraph, which is under my Windows General Editor's hypergraph hierarchy, and the hypergraph is analogous to the schematic view in 3ds Max for 3ds Max users in the course, I'll see that my finger chains are parented to that wrist in that specific order. So the middle finger is first, the index is second, the ring is third, the pinky is fourth, and the thumb is last. And that's the order that Human IK will be looking for. So you'll want to match that configuration when you parent your joints. Okay, So now I'm going to rename each of the joints so that they match the naming convention that the human IK rigging system that we'll use later in the course will look for. And the naming convention is a little counterintuitive, as you'll see, but if you wanted to create your own character later on and use the human IK rigging system, which you'll see later on is just about the best rig that you can possibly use, and it's incredibly fast and simple to set up, and very intuitive to animate with. Using the naming convention that it looks for will save you time. So it's a good idea to get used to this naming convention. So as I mentioned earlier, the spine that you see here is really just the top part of it. So theoretically, if this were an entire character, the spine would begin down here at the bottom of the spine, and that would be the first spine joint named spine, then spine 1, spine 2. So I recommend 6 joints in the spine chain. So this would be the last spine joint, this would be the first neck joint, so this would be spine 6. So this very first joint that we're working with, being just the top part of the spine, I'm going to call that spine 5. And it's important that you use the exact names here, including capitalization, and that you avoid typos, because if there are typos in your joint names, if you were setting up your own character, the Human IK control rig would not be able to validate those joint names if you have typos in them. So I'll name this capital S spine 5. The next one I'll name spine 6. This I'll name neck, capital N. Now here's where the naming convention gets a bit awkward. This joint at the clavicle will be called left shoulder, because this is the left arm, so we'll call this left shoulder, and the joint that you would consider your shoulder will actually be named left arm. So I'll name this joint capital L left, capital S shoulder, and then this joint will be left arm, capital L, capital A. This will be left arm roll, so capital L, left, capital A, arm, capital R for roll. Again, no spaces between the words. And then the joint at the elbow, again, slightly counterintuitive, will be called left forearm. Capital L for left, capital F for fore, capital A for arm. This joint will be called left forearm roll. Again, capital L, capital F, capital A, capital R. And then this will be left hand, capital L, capital H. And then I'll name all of the finger joints. And the naming convention for the fingers will be left hand middle 1, left hand middle 2, and so on. Left hand index 1, left hand index 2, and so on. So I'll copy left hand here, and I'll go through the same order that we parented. So I'll start with the middle, so left hand middle, and I'll copy the name each time when I start, so I don't have to retype it each time. But the first one will be left hand middle 1. And then I can just paste this each time. Left hand middle 2. Left hand middle 3. And left hand middle 4. And then the index. Capital I for index. Copy that. And that'll be left hand index 1. Left hand index 2. 3, and then 4, and the ring, capital R for ring, copy that, left hand index, and that'll be left hand ring 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pinky, capital P, copy it, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then finally the thumb. Capital T, copy. And there we go. So again, starting with the first joint for us, which would be the top part of the spine, spine 5, spine 6, and then neck. The joint at the clavicle would be left shoulder. Joint at the shoulder is left arm. The upper arm twist joint is left arm roll. The elbow joint is left forearm. The forearm twist joint is left forearm roll. The wrist joint is left hand. And then each of the fingers are left hand middle, 1 through 4, left hand index 1 through 4, left hand ring 1 through 4, left hand pinky 1 through 4, and left hand thumb 1 through 4. So I'll save this. And now I want to display what are known as the local rotation axes for all of these joints. And the local rotation axes determine about which axes the joints rotate in each direction and the angle of those axes. So I'll go back to my hypergraph here. And I'll just scroll over the entire joint chain to select all of those joints. And then I'm going to deselect the last joint in each finger chain. Because again, the last joint in the chain has no role in the animation or the skinning, so I don't need to worry about those local rotation axes. So I'll deselect the left hand middle 4, index 4, ring 4, pinky 4, and thumb 4. And deselecting is done with Control and left clicking. And then I'll go to Display, Transform Display, Local Rotation Axes. And you can see that these axes pop up for each joint that show you which direction they're rotating in. And you can see that most of them are consistent through each of the chains, but you can see some of them aren't. So you see that the spine joints and the neck, the axes don't point in the same directions, and I want to get them pointing in the same direction. And when you're rigging in Maya, the local rotation axis setup that you want to use is that X is pointing to the next joint in the chain and Z is pointing forward. So I want to set up the local rotation axes so that they're consistent throughout the skeleton here. And then I want to angle the fingers to reflect the angle of the model so that the fingers curl slightly inward and the thumb rotates towards the front of the palm. So the way to access the local rotation axes is that just like the vertices and edges and faces are subcomponents of this model, of this object, arm mesh, the local rotation axes are subcomponents of the joints. So I'll select the first joint in my chain, which is the spine 5, and then I'll click on the Select by Component Type button on my menu bar. And first I'm going to turn all of my components off so that I can't select anything, and then I'll turn on just local rotation axes so that when I scroll over them, I'm only selecting the local rotation axes. So the arrow to the right of the Select by Component Type button allows you to turn all components on or off. So I'm going to turn them all off. And you'll see that they're all undepressed now. And then I'm going to right click over the question mark here and choose just local rotation axes. And that way I can select just the local rotation axes in my scene. So I'd want to rotate this one, for example, so that X is pointing to the next joint in the chain, which it is, but I want Z to be pointing forward. And right now, Y is pointing forward, as you can see. So I'd want to rotate this in the X so that Z is pointing forward. But right now, I'm rotating this manually, and I want to rotate it exactly 90 degrees. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to double-click on my Rotate tool, and I'm going to turn on the Step Snap to Absolute, and set this to 90. And I'll turn this off when I'm finished with this process so that I can rotate freely again. So now every time I drag here, I'll be rotating exactly 90 degrees. So now you can see that Z is pointing perfectly forward. I'll move on to the next joint. So I'll rotate this in the other direction so that Z is pointing forward. And then for the neck, I want to rotate it so that X is pointing up. So in this case, I'll rotate in the Z. And you can see now that for each of these joints, the local rotation has X pointing to the next joint in the chain. So theoretically, the neck would go up in that direction. So X is pointing to there. That next joint would be. Z is pointing forward, and Y is pointing to the side. So my left shoulder joint looks good. X is pointing to the next joint in the chain. Z is pointing forward. Left arm looks good. And I'll hide my locators temporarily so this is a little easier for you to see. You can see that all of my joint chains in the arm look good. I have X pointing to the next joint in the chain and Z pointing forward. So now I'm going to rotate the local rotation axes for each of the fingers so that they reflect the angles that you see on the model. So I'll go back to my rotate tool and I'll turn this off again so that I can rotate freely. And I'll start with the index. And I'm just going to hold down shifts and select all of these at the same time. And again, I don't need to worry about the last one here. And I'll rotate these so that they match the angle of the finger. And like I said, even the middle rotates slightly towards the center. So I'll rotate these local rotation axes just a little bit to reflect that angle. Same thing for the ring. Pinky. And then the thumb. And that looks good. So now I have this slight angle represented for each of these. Go back to my object mode. You can see that these angles are reflected on the fingers and the thumb, and that all of the local rotation axes are consistent throughout the skeleton now. So I'm going to turn off the display of the local rotation axes again because it's a bit distracting and we don't need to look at those anymore. Scroll over the joint chain again in my hypergraph. Deselect the last finger joint in each chain. Again, go back to display, transform display, local rotation axes, and that way I'll turn them off. I'll save this. And I'm going to create a new layer for my skeleton. You can see there's already a layer. And you can see there's already a display layer for the mesh that allows you to toggle the display of the model on and off. You can also toggle the display from template, which allows you to see through the model even when it's in shaded mode. You can't select it. Reference, which allows you to see it in shaded, but you also can't select it, and then normal. So I'm going to select the first joint in my chain, which is spine 5, and then click on the button all the way to the right that says create a new layer and assign selected objects. Double click on that layer, and I'll name this arm skeleton, and that way I can toggle the display of the skeleton as well. Save this.